This story happened to me and my girlfriend, now fiancé, and to give you some context, she and I met online in 2015 and fell in love. We communicated via Skype for 3 years because we lived in separate countries, until I eventually came to live with her in February 2018. So a few weeks or so before I flew to meet her, she had made friends with a group of guys in her hometown, and I got to meet them shortly after moving in with her. They ranged in age from 16 to 18, and they would often come over to visit us as we lived close to the high school they attended. At first I found it a bit weird that they would always come over and take up so much of our time, but over time it turned out that they'd become really good friends of mine. One of them even agreed to be one of my groomsmen. But back then there was one in particular that always bugged me. Dan. As I mentioned earlier, the guys would come and visit and hang out with us a lot, but Dan was the one that would always take up most of our time. I say this in the sense that he would message us early almost every day asking if we were home and if he could come over, then would proceed to spend almost the entire day from morning to night or early afternoon to night, depending on his work schedule, at our place. He would also go out of his way to meet us and bump into us whenever we went, whether it was to the store, a coffee shop, or any other place you could think of. While I found this annoying, there wasn't anything particularly creepy or weird going on. Yet. Mind you, we live in a small town, where it's almost impossible to not run into someone you know on a daily basis. Plus I had only known him for just about as long as my fiancé had, which wasn't a very long time, so I thought I was maybe judging him too harshly. Also, he was in a long-distance relationship too, with a girl from another country, whom he was hoping to meet in real life, just like me, so I could at least relate to him in that aspect. I decided to let it slide, but made a note to keep an eye out for any suspicious behavior. The problems seemed to start once he also started trying to incorporate himself into other aspects of our life. He would make friends with anyone we'd be friends with for a long time, tag along with us whenever we were going to meet up with said friends, even though he hadn't even been invited, and hang out with them without us knowing, etc. The most memorable instance, and the one that made me become more suspicious of him, was a time when we were going to hang out with some long-time friends of my fiancé. As the friend had finished her shift and we were getting ready to get into her car to drive over to her place, Dan suddenly shows up and joins us to their place, uninvited. It was just so off-putting that he would just invite himself over without our friends or even our permission. Then when we were done there and walking home, the 3 of us passed his house. We lived further away at the time, and we assumed that he'd just go home. But nope. He kept tagging along with us with the excuse that he needed to buy something at the store, which was a lie since all the stores had been closed for over an hour, and he knew it. So he kept walking with us until we'd got to the point where we were almost home. We put our foot down and told him to go home as we were tired and just wanted to go to sleep as soon as we got in. It took us 10 minutes to convince him, during which he would react to our requests with awkward and creepy silences until he finally headed home, annoyed. My fiancé, concerned that she'd offended him, asked if he wanted to hang out with us later in the week. What followed was various weeks of him coming over to our place, staying until late at night, and him slowly leaving more and more of his stuff at our place, so he'd have an excuse to come over. Honestly, he once brought over his PS3 with a bag of 30 or so games, which ended up staying there for 3 months. It got to the point where people thought he'd moved in with us, hence the title of this story. He also seemed to have problems with all our friends, and he would get into arguments with them, telling one friend who was goofing around at our place once that he'd kill him if he didn't shut up. He lied to us and made us believe that two good friends of ours wanted to report us to the police for drugging our, at the time, 16-year-old friends. He'd allegedly hit one of their girlfriends once, although this was never confirmed, but I have no reason to believe that it's a lie. It was like he wanted us all to himself and to isolate us from everyone else. The last thing he did, which ended up being the key to us getting rid of him forever, was that he started dating my fiancé's cousin, MJ. He broke up with his long-distance girlfriend under suspicious circumstances and started dating her. As a result, whenever MJ came to visit, Dan would come along as well. My fiancé wanted to hang out with MJ, and there was Dan. Even when he was dating someone else, his obsession with us never ended. One day when we were in town, we met another friend of ours, and Dan insisted that we hang out with that guy all day when we'd already agreed to do something else. When we refused, he and MJ ditched us to be with him. That was when we'd had enough. We got into a huge fight later that day in a park with some of our friends as witnesses and told him we wanted nothing more to do with him and to pack up his shit and never show his face at our place again. Though this unfortunately resulted in my fiancé and MJ not talking to each other for a long time. We've had to move a few times since, the most recent being February of last year, and we never saw him again. We blocked him on all our social media and out of our lives completely. We'd heard from friends that he'd asked around as to where we live a few times, but our friends have always had our backs and haven't told him. MJ and my fiancé recently made up after she dumped him, and now that the sour taste he has left behind is, for the most part, gone, it goes without saying that we never want to see him again. Edit. People have asked about his parents or what his home life was like, and whether this might have affected his behavior. He does have parents, but I have no idea what his home life was like. All I know from friends and hearsay is that he apparently has violent tendencies and that his family had to move from his hometown in the past because he'd been accused of allegedly raping a teenager. I wouldn't rule it out. He can also be very manipulative. He was 18 when we first met him and should be 20 by now. We found out recently that he moved out of his parents' house and had gotten his own place. Some people have considered the possibility that he might have been in love with or obsessed with my girlfriend. While I wouldn't rule it out, it was after talking to my fiancé's cousin that we figured another possible explanation. Dan loves to talk about cars, and he found out that my father-in-law likes to collect vintage cars and that he'd recently gotten his hands on a vintage highway patrol police car. As I mentioned, he tries to use people to get what he wants, and he figured if he could get along with us well enough, he'd get a chance to ride shotgun with him, or even borrow the car. There was no chance that would happen though, since Daddy-in-law treats that car like his own son and would never let anyone else drive it. So yeah, tough luck, Danny. And to the people commenting how weird it is that we were hanging out with 16 to 18-year-olds, first of all, yes, we do have a lot of friends our own age, and we do hang out plenty with them as well. I'll admit I found it weird myself at first, when they would always come over and want to hang out with us, and was concerned about whatever rumours might start floating around. But the more I got to know them, the more I understood that they were pretty down to earth overall. Yeah, they could goof around a bit when we were hanging out, but for the most part they're surprisingly mature for their age. Also, they would always ask first if they could come over, and they trusted us enough to confide in us with whatever was on their mind. Also, their parents know us and trust us as well, and they didn't feel the need to keep it a secret that they were friends with us. One friend's mum had recently died of cancer at the time, and we found out from his father that he seemed happier and less depressed about it whenever he came home after spending time with us. Besides, we like to consider our home a safe space where anyone is welcome regardless of age, gender, race, etc. Well, not literally anyone, but you know what I mean. And while in hindsight that might have been part of the reason why someone like Dan slithered their way into our lives, as long as you're respectful and kind, we wouldn't have it any other way. On my first summer back home from freshman year of college, I picked up a part-time job delivering pizza in a town around 30 minutes away from where I lived. The area, in rural Georgia, is known for having places that are in the middle of nowhere, and the pizza place's whole shtick was that it delivered to even the most remote areas imaginable within the town limits. I could fill out books with the weird experiences that summer, from the call that came from a long-abandoned warehouse to the dog that got excited about the pizza in my hand and accidentally shredded my pants with her claws. But one particular story will always stand out in my mind as the creepiest. It was getting fairly late that night, around 10:30 p.m, so I was confident at the time that I would be sent on no further calls before closing at 11. However, someone barely managed to miss the cut-off time, and our clerk accepted their order since they were so close. I was given the address and a single box of hot dough and sent on my merry little way. The first red flag was the driveway, or rather the lack thereof. There was a mailbox but no actual driveway, not even gravel. It was just grass and a barely distinguishable trodden pathway that resembled more of a service trail than it did something frequently used. I bumped along, wondering if I was even en route to the right place, when I saw a slightly above average sized house come over the horizon. It was horribly dilapidated and completely surrounded by overgrown woods. I guesstimated where the rest of the driveway led and ended up parking in a grassy patch that could have been the walkway just as easily as it could have been the front yard. My headlights were aimed towards the porch, as per company policy. I walked up to the door, but I believe that calling it a door was a generous description. It was a door frame all right, but the door itself was just a large slab of wood propped haphazardly against the side of the house, barely covering the entrance. This was red flag number 2. The third and fourth red flags were also on the door. This included the A4 sheet of printer paper with the words, "Around back," scribbled in all caps, which was hanging just below the place where somebody had self-engraved the door with the title, Manson Family Ranch. Typically I would never go around to the back of a house, especially a shady, unlit house like this one, and especially at night. However, it was my last drop of the day, and I was ready to get it over with and be on my way home. But against my better judgment, I traipsed around to the back of the house. The door back there was an actual door, but it was covered in both cobwebs and fresh spider webs. Clearly this was a door that had not been used in some time. I found the cleanest area available and knocked. I counted to 45 and knocked again. There were no lights on in the house, and I could hear no movement from inside. I knocked and counted again, and repeated the sequence 3 more times before I was finally creeped enough to decide to return to my car. As I turned, though, I finally heard a voice coming from inside the house, and it was clearly agitated, but I couldn't tell what they were saying. I tried to knock 1 more time, and as I was counting again, I heard something in the woods behind me. It started out as just movement, deep in the trees, but soon enough I could make out distinct running footsteps coming directly towards me through the brush. As I'm standing there, coming to terms with my impending demise, I followed the direction of the noise to the edge of the woods, which is around 15 feet away from me. In the moonlight I could clearly see a woman who stepped out. She was relatively old, maybe in her 60s I would guess. She had long blonde grey hair, which was tangled and matted and hung down past her hips. She was wearing what looked to be originally a white nightgown, but at that time it was dingy and closer to a beigeish-brown colour. She was completely barefoot, and her feet were covered in dirt and what had to be blood, presumably due to the fact that she had just sprinted through the prickly woods where there was no trail to be seen. I never learned her name, but I still affectionately referred to her as Red Flag Number 5. She stopped short when she saw me and started to shake her head no, her eyes wide. I stood there like a terrified deer in the most messed up headlights ever, as she took a few more steps towards me, reaching out to me, finger pointed. Her voice came out way stronger than mine would have at the time when she spoke. You know how Southern people can either sound like loving grandmothers or backwoods murderers? Well, she sounded like the latter when she drawled. "Oh, no, 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 no. No, honey, no. You get on, you get on out of here." I wish I could say I listened, ran and left, but I was so in shock at how events were playing out that my own self-preservation was put on a back burner while I tried to figure out just what in Kentucky Fried Bleep was happening. She seemed to realize that I was not moving, even if I could not make my mouth move to ask her what was happening or even what to do with the stupid pizza in my hands. She looked at me like she could have smacked the hell out of me right then and there, and proceeded to deliver red flags 6 through 12. "Did you hear me? You deaf or dumb? Young girls like you come out here, and then they don't get to leave." So I finally quit being the white person in a horror movie when I realized that this was not a funny little ghost story. This was a 5'3", 116-pound me, potentially being targeted to be robbed, kidnapped or worse. So I dropped the dumb little pizza, which had serious serial killer toppings by the way, and started running back to my car, which I had stupidly left on and unlocked, as was usual for most of my deliveries. As I neared the car, I heard a slam from behind me, and I looked over my shoulder to see that the wooden door had been pushed over and had fallen into the porch beneath it. As I was closing the car door, an older man was limping down the front steps, waving his arms like an airplane runway attendant at me, calling me a little bitch, and yelling at me to get out of the car now. At a loss for what to do, I called out something muttery and shaky and along the lines of, "Pizza's out back." I floored my dad's crappy little 90s Lexus and somehow managed to avoid trees on the odd trail back to the main road, which was still 12 miles and several turns from any road that actually had a name, let alone painted lines. I reported it to my manager, and he said he'd contacted the police, but nothing ever came of it that I'm aware of. Either way, that was my first, and hopefully last, personal encounter with the self-proclaimed Manson family ranch. This happened when I was about 19 or 20. I was driving home from working the closing shift at my local casual dining establishment that rhymes with Crapplebee's. Looking back, I can say this was the point in my life where I was too afraid of being rude to set boundaries for people, let alone flat out saying no when I felt uncomfortable. I generally took the long way home and drove through downtown after work. It gave me time to unwind and listen to music, smoke a bowl, and let go of whatever happened during my shift waiting tables. This particular night, it was about 1:45 a.m. and approaching bar close. I was waiting at a red light across from this bar in downtown, and I had my windows open, just enjoying the nice weather. There were lots of people outside of this bar smoking and waiting on rides, etc., when I noticed this man and his very intoxicated friend started to approach my car. As I said, there were lots of people outside, and I just smoked a bowl, so I'm feeling good and not really threatened in any way. Initially, he asked me for a ride. I kind of laugh it off because it's ridiculous to approach a young woman waiting at a red light and ask for a ride, so I thought he must have been joking. But his drunk friend just opens my back door and lays down in the back seat. The more sober of the two approaches my passenger side, tells me it's just a few blocks, and could I give them a ride. I reluctantly accepted, thinking, okay, there's plenty of people outside still. I can just start screaming if anything happens, or literally bolt from my car into the arms of one of these other strangers outside. I know. Besides, I like to see the best in people and help out when I could. I started driving the few blocks in the opposite direction of my destination, out of downtown, and the amount of people outside were getting less and less the further I drove. It truly started to dawn on me at this point that my reasoning that this was in any way okay because it was a short distance, or assuming that anybody else would even come to my rescue, was completely ridiculous, and I needed to rid myself of these two as soon as possible. The whole time, the man in my passenger seat was turned completely sideways and staring at me in silence. His friend presumably passed out in the back seat. He had me turn off the main, semi-populated road at this point, and I asked him how much further. He said it was just at the end of the block, where there is an apartment building and an underground parking complex. I pulled up to the entrance of the parking ramp and waited for them to get out. Passenger seat guy starts trying to convince me that I need to help him carry his drunk-ass friend up to their apartment, and I should just pull into a spot in the garage. I am now overwhelmed with the realization of how incredibly stupid and reckless I have been. I tell him he needs to get his friend out first, and I will help him walk up. He gets out and walks around to my side of the car to get his friend out. As soon as most of his body is out of my car, I gas it and don't look back. There are a few other situations where I knew I had reacted inappropriately, but this one takes the cake. Complete and utter disregard for my own safety. I was young and often told how beautiful I was, hit on constantly, and knew the reactions I would get just politely saying no to someone requesting my phone number. Honestly, I would usually just say okay and then ghost the person because I didn't want to deal with the backlash if I declined. I'm glad it ended up being a funny story that I get to tell my friends who listen in horror, as opposed to something much worse. I can't say what my job was, because what I did was literally the name of the company. It had something to do with law in a small basement office. This office had 2 main rooms and a bathroom. The boss worked in the room in the back, while the rest of us, 3 in total, worked in the front. This wasn't a place where clients came and met with us. It was just where we got work done on computers and packages sent before leaving. Often I worked alone the last 3 hours of the shift, which in reality was great. I got to listen to whatever music I wanted, sing along and get stuff done on the computer. On occasion my boss would come to pick up something or get a bit more work done, and on this day he did, but he came in with an older gentleman that I didn't recognize. My boss explained that the man was a customer from one of the companies on the top floor, and he'd left only to realize he really needed to go to the bathroom and asked to use ours. My boss stuck around near my desk until the man left and then got to work. As I continued to work, I began to cough and wheeze a bit. Breathing became painful, and at first I didn't know why, until I gradually got a whiff of smoke. Cigarette smoke. None of my co-workers smoked, and I don't know if I'm allergic or intolerant to cigarette smoke, but I instantly feel ill whenever I begin breathing it in. I shrugged it off and just paid attention to my breathing, being sure nothing bad was happening to me, and not soon after, my boss grabbed his coat and began to leave. He said, "Your co-worker will be coming in a bit, just to pick some stuff up." And as he opened the door, the scent of smoke burst through, and my boss said there were cigarette butts on the ground. Thus he continued with, "And let's have you lock the door behind me too." I couldn't agree more. That was creepy. But if it was the man who used our bathroom, it wasn't too strange to assume he'd hunkered at the bottom of the stairs to take in some smoke before leaving. When my boss left, I made extra sure that door was locked before continuing with my work. Another hour had passed by, about an hour and a half remaining of work, when I began to smell smoke again. My heart sank as I turned my eyes to the door and quietly got up from my chair. I usually took off my shoes at work. Like I said, we didn't have clients come there, so we were pretty chill when it came to wardrobe. But even with them off, I tiptoed over to the door and pressed my ear against it. I didn't hear anything at first. However, the scent of smoke was prominent there. Even as a married woman, I was still fairly young at the time and just didn't know what to do. For one reason or another, I decided to just go back to my desk and wait until my co-worker had arrived. Not even 10 minutes more though, and I heard this click, click, click sound. It was subtle and I had to look around to spot where it was coming from. It was the doorknob of our office. From where I sat, I could see it just slightly jerk back and forth. The person was doing it slowly, as I was sure they were trying to be quiet. By this point, I called up my co-worker to come sooner. In some ways, I felt safe, as I was in a locked area after all, but who knows, right? After calling him, the scent began to diminish, and the doorknob stopped moving. I tried to listen for someone going up the stairs, but I didn't hear anything for a long while, until I heard someone coming down them. It was my co-worker. He came in and said, "There are like 10 cigarette butts out here." I explained what had happened as he came in and locked the door behind himself. I also told him about the man who'd come in to use our bathroom earlier. Like I said, I couldn't be sure if they were the same person. There wasn't much to take from the offices. The computers were fairly old and wouldn't at all get a good chunk of money from them. And everything else was paper. We weren't at all a place that kept money around either. So if it was him, I can't fathom what he saw that he'd feel the need to come back in to steal. My co-worker somewhat brushed it off, as he'd figured the person was gone. All was fine and he carried on with picking up what he needed to. But he ended up staying for a while. I'm not sure why though. Perhaps he felt like he needed to, because as I began finally finishing up my work, the smell of smoke came back. My co-worker and I looked at each other, almost as a way to confirm that we'd both smelled it. The click-clacking of our computers stopped and we just waited and waited and waited. We didn't take our eyes off each other as the click, click, click came back. I couldn't deal with this any longer, and I just wanted to go home as soon as possible. But I shirked the thought of walking out there. My co-worker was far more fed up. He stood, stomped to the door, unlocked it and opened it, and there was a man there. I didn't get a good look at him, but I saw him raise his arm, freeze. Then he disappeared and sprinted up the stairs. My co-worker walked me to my car soon after, told our boss about it, and we made it a rule that we always lock the door from that point on, especially me, because after that day, every now and then, I'd smell smoke and hear the doorknob attempt to twist. Whenever I did, I either called up my boss or just waited, as every now and then I heard the steps leave. Frankly, we should have put up a camera or called the police, done something at least. When my co-worker described him to my boss, it seemed like it was the same man who used our bathroom, but that was just speculation. We have no idea what he wanted or if there was a purpose. Be careful letting people use your bathrooms. They could have ulterior motives. Hi, this is the story of some dumb decisions that I made back in February 2019 whilst visiting a Tennessee Walmart. At the time I was 12 years old and had been visiting Tennessee for the first time for a dance competition that I was competing in. On this particular night it was around 11 p.m. and my mum, my grandma and I had to pick up some things at Walmart for the competition the next day. We had just finished dinner, so almost as soon as we had gotten there, my mum had to use the bathroom. She was in there for a while, so I was just waiting outside with my shopping cart, surfing Insta on the crappy Walmart Wi-Fi. My grandmother was waiting in the car. She had been in the bathroom for about 10 minutes, and I was growing more and more bored, so I decided that I would start surfing the aisles around me just to keep my short attention span in check, hoping that I would find something shiny to distract me. I turned the third aisle, and once I was about halfway through, a shorter man with a plastic Walmart bag in his hand rounded the corner and started slowly stalking behind me. I didn't get a good look at him, but I could definitely tell he was there. It wasn't until he got about a foot behind me that I realized that he was way too close for comfort. I started getting tunnel vision and my eyes felt all tingly, so I decided that I should get out of there quickly and start walking away, trying to look as normal as possible. Once I got a couple of feet in front of him, I basically started running, winding quickly between aisles, trying to lose him. I was trying to find an aisle with people, but every time I would get to a small group, they would walk away. I would stop in an aisle thinking I had lost him, and then he would turn the corner, so I would keep running. I finally lost him once I got to the shoe section. Again, this place was unfamiliar and totally backwards to the Walmart that I was used to, so I didn't know how to get back to the bathrooms. I started following the walls until I made it back to them after about 25 minutes had passed. I parked the cart back outside and went into the bathrooms, looking for my mum. I thought she was still in there, so I propped myself up against a wall and pulled out my phone. 6 missed calls. My mum had been calling me the entire time, and she was freaking out. I answered, almost in tears, and she started screaming at me. "Where are you?" I vaguely explained to her what had happened, too overwhelmed and panicky to explain clearly. She and my grandmother, whom she had called to help look for me, met up with me in the bathrooms. They told me people had been calling my name over the speaker, but it was probably when I was in the bathroom. That's why I didn't hear it. We reported the guy to the employees, paid for our stuff and left. I made very dumb decisions during this encounter, so if you ever find yourself in a situation similar to mine, which I hope you don't, then abandon your shopping cart. Whatever items you had picked up, you can pick them up later, and tell someone that you're being followed. Better to be safe than sorry. I should also have turned to face him. There were people around, and if he would have tried anything, they could have heard my screams, as dark as that sounds. Most of the time, when people face their attackers and show bravery, they get caught off guard. Please pardon my memory, as this was more than 15 years ago, but my mum confirmed my story when we were talking recently. I had actually forgotten about it until she brought it up. So a little backstory. I've always had good intuition. A lot of women have it, but for me it's been very strong my entire life. Maybe it was my parents instilling stranger danger into every new day, or maybe it was something else. But young me had no real reason to react the way I had, but I'm glad I did. It was my best friend's birthday party, and we were all going roller skating in the town next to ours. Her brother is my brother's best friend, and her mum is my mum's best friend. I arrive at the party and lights are flashing, the room is buzzing, and Pitbull Mr. Worldwide songs are playing loudly. Off-the-wall stuff in the early 2000s, and it was the party of my young life. All my friends and classmates were there, and my mum too, as she was so close to my friend's mum. I got my skates and put them on, then give my shoes to my mum. As I'm putting them on and chatting with my friends, one of the roller referees came up and started talking to us. I don't remember much of what he said, but I remember the feeling I had when he came up to us, and I'm feeling it now as I'm writing this. That feeling is dread. Something was off about that man. He was tall and thin, middle-aged I think. His hair was dark and thinning, and he had a thick moustache. He was very weird. Being a happy little elementary schooler, I went to skate with some of my other classmates, but when my other friends started skating, so did he. When we all sat on the sidelines, he would skate by and give us all high fives, and then do another lap to come sit with us. I remember him trying to hug some of the kids as well. This is when young me started to get scared. We'd been there for less than an hour, had been skating for less than 45 minutes, but I decided to tell my mum I was feeling sick and needed to go home. I wasn't, but I didn't think my mum would listen to me if I told her I was afraid of that man. Looking back on it though, I definitely should have. My mum would have bitched this guy out in front of his boss. My friend's mum tried to get me to stay by saying she was going to be giving out gifts to all the kids, as the birthday girl had too many toys already. Rich kids, eh? I was insistent that I was sick and needed to leave, so my mum took me home. I had no fever, and I was not vomiting, so my mum asked me why I really wanted to leave. I think after a couple of days I eventually told her about the weird man who wanted to touch me and my friends. Granted, they were just high fives and hugs, which I give to kids I know all the time, but only kids that I know. I'm still stunned though that even at that age I knew he was weird. I thought that was the end of it, until I was talking with my mum recently and found out a couple of years after that incident he was arrested for having child porn on his computer. I am proud of my young self for identifying a predator and leaving the situation. Even if I couldn't have been honest at the time, I wish I had been, because I feel like I've put others in danger now by not. But I was young and terrified of him. At least now, though, he's behind bars. It all started at a friend's house. Myself and 2 others were invited to hang out with a buddy who I will be calling Chris. As for the 2 others, they will be called James and Annie. It was around 10:45 p.m. when we arrived at his house. Upon our arrival, we walked up to his front door. I reached my hand out to knock on the door, and as soon as my fist made contact with it, it flew open. An excited Chris greeted us with a loud hello, and we all greeted each other and made our way into his home. We all sat down in his living room and were talking for a few minutes when Chris said, "I am so hungry." "Go eat something then," Annie said. "Like what?" Chris yelled. We shushed him down, and that's when James said, How about we get some McDonald's? As soon as those words left James's mouth, Chris jumped up and ran to the door. "Let's go eat," he said with an excited tone. I reluctantly stood up and made my way over to Chris, as I didn't really want to go, but I was hungry. Annie sighed as she stood up. It was obvious she didn't want to go either. But it was free food. She knew we'd pay for her. After we all got our jackets and shoes on, we left the house. I won't bore you with the small details of our walk, as the scary stuff worth mentioning happened around the halfway mark. We'd been walking for around 10 minutes when we see a lady. She was wearing a white t-shirt with a bunch of different coloured stains on it and a pair of blue shorts that barely fit her. As we got closer, we realised she was talking, but no one was with her. I remember a little bit of what she was saying, something about Utah State and the lady next door. I was quite paranoid at this point and was thinking that as we were going to walk past her, someone in the bushes was going to jump out and attack us. As we got closer, I said quite loudly, enough for her to hear, "Last one to McDonald's has to pay." And with that, we all broke out into a sprint. But right before we were about to pass her, Chris stopped right in front of this woman. As I walked towards Chris, I noticed he was talking to her. This is when I was able to get a good look at her. It was dark, but I could just about make out a head of crusty black brown hair and dark eyes that seemed to have something in them, something that made me feel bad for her. Her teeth were brown and rotting, and her breath smelled like death. I tapped Chris on his shoulder to get his attention, but he swiftly pushed my hand away as he was still engaged in conversation with this woman, who I now know as Linda. "Where are you kids heading?" she said, her voice dry and raspy. "Just to McDonald's," Chris answered. "How old are you guys?" she said. Her face was twitching as she said it. 15, he answered, and with that a huge grin appeared on her face. She slowly stood up, causing all of us to back away as she took a step closer, and with that we ran. She gave chase though, all the while screaming things like, "I'm not going to hurt you," and "Oh, come on, you scared of a little old lady?" She was frail and looked like a skeleton, and I don't know how she was able to move at the speed she was. The big golden arches appeared in front of us, and we ran even faster. She realized she couldn't catch up, so she picked up a rock and threw it at us, and it hit me in the back. As we got closer to the McDonald's, we could hear her scream things like, "Stupid kids," and "Oh, I'm gonna get you all." We pushed through the McDonald's entrance and started panting. Annie slouched down into a seat with James, while Chris and I went to order. We got our food and all sat down. We ate in silence, as we were all still pretty shook up by what had just happened. Once we were done eating, we started heading back to Chris's house. On our way, we saw the lady in the gas station across the street, so we ran the rest of the way so she wouldn't see us. In the end, we made it back safe and sound, and this is now a story we can all laugh about. I understand this isn't the scariest story, but to my buddies and I, it was terrifying. So this just happened to me like 15 minutes ago, and more than anything, I'm just embarrassed that I couldn't have just rolled it off my back and not gotten scared. I live in a fairly low-rent, shady apartment complex since I'm in college, and it's what I can afford. Obviously, we're all social distancing for COVID-19 right now, but I really wanted to try to get just a bit more sunlight to help keep my sanity from being home all day, every day. So I went out of my apartment and sat on a bench near the bus stop, just to sit for a little while. I put my earbuds in and called a friend. In my peripheral vision, I could see people standing outside their doors, smoking cigarettes, and a lady walking her dog, but we were all at the very least like 40 feet away from each other, so no one seemed worried. A couple were talking outside their door, and for a moment I thought they were looking at me. I figured I was just being paranoid though, until the woman started walking in my direction. As she was walking, I was keeping an eye on it, but trying to keep acting like I hadn't noticed. The bench I was on was near the mailboxes for the whole complex and the bus stop, so I figured there were plenty of reasons other than me she could be coming that way. That was until she stopped just in front of me. I looked up and noticed I'd seen this woman once before on the bus. She wears a lot of very heavy, dramatic makeup, including drawing on a set of eyebrows just below the ones she's already growing. She once started talking to me on my morning bus ride to school and gave me an itemized list of things she didn't like about my face. I had just sort of smiled and nodded, and then looked the other way the rest of the trip. It looked like maybe she was talking, so I pulled my earbuds out and hung up on my friend abruptly. "Sorry?" I said. "Could you call the police for me?" she said. "Oh, okay," I said, picking up my phone. "Actually, never mind," she said quickly. She looked nervous. "Are you sure?" "Yeah. Could I have $1?" I told her I didn't have any change and apologized. "Oh, okay. Actually, could you call the police for me?" "Yes," I said again, unlocking my phone. "Wait, actually it's fine," she said, now smiling at me. Now when she said it the first time, my brain at first thought, she's not visibly injured, maybe she's in trouble. Had she been fighting with that man I saw her with before? Was she in danger? Was she being so casual with me because she needed help but didn't want to alert someone that she was trying to get it? I looked her in the eyes and said, "Are you sure? I really can call someone if you need it." She said no, it's fine. Now some important context about me is that I have some history of trauma. I don't really want to elaborate too much, but the short of it is that I'm left with a lot of fear of people touching me or violating my personal space. Because some things from when I was growing up, my body now has basically the worst response when someone violates my boundaries, which is to go very limp and let the other person do whatever they want to me, in the hopes that if I don't struggle, they won't hurt me as much. It's basically the worst response I could have, but it's very hard to reprogram my body. Due to my mental health issues, I've also spent significant periods of my life in psychiatric hospitals for treatment. I've met a lot of different people with different issues in the hospital, so I have a bit of a sense for when someone might not be all there mentally. The longer I talked to this woman, the more of a sense I got that she was perhaps not totally in her right mind. Now in the hospital, I've had similar experiences where someone who wasn't fully lucid cornered me and I got trapped in a potentially not safe situation. This all made worse by my inability to A. get people to just leave me alone, and B. protect my physical space when my body's being triggered into fight or flight. In the hospital when this happens, the hope is that staff notice and help me get away, with mixed results as a lot of things go on in hospitals that staff end up either unaware of or not noticing until it's too late, but that's a different story. So at that moment, my body decided it was time to mess me over. I started to realize that this woman was getting closer and closer to me, and probably not totally well in the head. My body started pumping adrenaline, which made my hands and legs start to feel weak. I felt like I couldn't get enough breath, and my head started to go a little fuzzy. The woman positioned herself to sit down next to me, and I started to try to get up. "Hey, do you want to walk to the store with me?" she said. I stood up. "Oh, sorry, I can't. I have to take my friend to, somewhere." I realized I couldn't think of a lie fast enough. My brain wasn't cooperating. He's been texting me all day and, sorry. "Okay," she said, now standing next to me. I started to walk from the bench back over to my building. My legs were feeling pretty wobbly, but I tried to walk as casually as possible. Behind me I could hear her following. She wasn't moving too fast. I thought maybe she thought I wouldn't notice. Still, I tried not to seem scared, not that my legs would have been able to run anyway. I got into my building about 60 seconds before her, and she was still definitely following me. I kept thinking, I just need to get into my apartment and lock the door before she sees which one is mine. My apartment is on the 2nd floor, but it's a short flight of stairs, and you can see my apartment door from the bottom where the main door to the building is. I tried to run up them, but my head was swimming and my legs weren't cooperating. It's like that feeling when you're half awake and you try to move your limbs, and they sort of do what you tell them to, but not really. Like they feel sort of far away from you and only semi under your control. I made it up the stairs, and luckily I had left my door unlocked. I got in and closed it behind me. Just as I heard her opening the main door to the building below me, I locked all 3 locks on my door and went over to the window to see if I could see her. She wasn't visible from the window, which meant she was still in my building. I texted my dad and asked if he thought I still ought to call the police. He told me I should. I went into my bedroom and called 911. Now the windows in my bedroom show the other side of the building and the back door. The operator asked for a description and if I knew where she was now, and I told her I couldn't see her out my front windows, so I thought she was still in the building. Then suddenly I saw her walk out and stand just below my window. The 911 operator said she'd send a few officers and to call them back if she left. I backed away from my window a bit. I was worried she'd see me looking at her, and then know which unit I was in. She looked around her for a bit, and then just slowly started wandering away towards a different building. Within about 5 minutes, 3 cop cars, it must have been a slow day, rolled in and stopped behind my apartment. They noticed her standing over by the other building, looking like she might try to walk to the woman walking her dog. 2 of the officers parked and went to talk to her, while the 3rd drove off. I watched as they talked to her for a while, and then eventually the man I'd seen her talking to at the start came out of a different building than they'd been standing in front of before and seemed to coax her in. The officer let her go and talked to the woman with the dog for a moment, then drove away. I think probably they decided she has mental health issues, but wasn't actively a threat to anyone, so they let it be, which is okay by me. I know that some people deal with chronic issues and can be a little alarming to the people in their community, but most of the time don't actually pose much of a threat. Now I'm just sitting here feeling like an overdramatic fool and waiting to regain full control of my limbs and for my heart rate to go down. But lady with 4 eyebrows, I'd really like us to stop meeting. A few years ago, I was working at a gym in my city. I had recently graduated from university and was working a part-time job in my field and needed another job to supply my hours. The fall before starting to work there, I began personal training with a coach at the gym and loved it. The gym had a warm and friendly community feel, which was perfect for me, and I loved working it. I worked the front desk and was mainly in charge of answering the phone, greeting people, and bringing clients on gym tours. Often there would be long periods of time where I wouldn't be too busy, and I could chat with members at the gym. I loved it. There were so many cool people that go there. But also, I came to learn that there are so many weird people too, which ultimately led me to quitting the job. When I started out there, I was a red-headed, fit, 22-year-old, fair-skinned, friendly, outgoing girl. But almost as soon as I began working there, I started to experience many odd and awkward advances from some of the members working out. I had one guy come up to me and say, "I just want to tell you that you are the most beautiful person I have ever seen." Many people asked for my number or my Instagram, and luckily for me at the time, I didn't have either to give, and I was also regularly asked on dates. I was single at the time, but that was by choice. I just didn't want to be dating, so I always gently declined. Unfortunately, there were numerous occasions where situations with male members escalated, and my boss did not react as sympathetically as I thought she would. I found out later that every time I reported an incident, she would make remarks to people that I should appreciate the attention and just go on the dates. This post is about one of these creepy moments with a client. It's important for you to know that the front desk was right at the front of the gym, so every client would pass me on their way in and out. Part of my job was to greet them and to say goodbye to them. The front desk was near the main water fountain, the changing rooms, and it was open and able to be seen by all the members working out on the first floor. There began to be this man, in his late 30s, early 40s, like I said, I was 22, who would walk by me and stare at me really intensely. I always felt it, and it would make me turn around. When I did, he would be staring at me. After a couple of weeks, he came up to me and told me he thought I had a beautiful smile. Now sometimes this is nice, and I take the compliment gracefully and move on. But something just felt completely off about it this time, so I reported it to my boss. This continued for weeks. He would come in, smile at me, stare at me while he was working out, and comment on my smile whenever he could. Most nights I didn't work the closing shifts, because the gym is 24/7 during the week. But one Friday night, I worked the close shift for a co-worker that couldn't make it in. Towards the end of my shift, around 8 p.m, this guy member came in. This evening I was feeling particularly tired. He noticed this and used it as an excuse to talk to me. He stopped me while I was walking by and said, "Where's the smile today? You look so much prettier when you smile." As usual, I just kinda carried on. A few minutes later, he came up and asked if we had tweezers, because he'd gotten a splinter in his finger. I looked in our first aid kit, and we had some, so I gave them to him. But he wasn't able to get it out himself, so he asked me for my help. I found this weird, but I was one of the only employees left in the building, and I felt obliged, so I grabbed his hand with one hand, and with the other tweezed out his splinter. Before he walked away, he said, "I don't think I'll ever wash this hand again." I'm not kidding, he literally said that. It was so creepy. From then on, I started to avoid him as much as I could. He'd left at 9:35 p.m. that night. I remember this because on the way out, he made another comment about my smile and how I must be happier because he likes it more that way. I looked at the time at that point because I was wondering what I would do if he stood there for a whole 30 minutes until close. My night finished normally and I closed by 10:15 p.m. The gym had a very dark parking lot at night, and we were one of the only buildings still open, so I was anticipating the parking lot to be empty, with the exception of my car. But this was not the case. Beside my car was another car with its headlights on. There was a trail nearby. Maybe it was people going for a walk. It was strange, though, that the car was parked so close to mine, but I continued to walk towards it regardless. As I got closer, though, I could see that it was the guy, the member from the gym. This was so weird. because as I said, he'd left the gym at 9:35 p.m. Did he wait here for me to leave? Why was he parked beside my car? Panic went through my whole body, and I felt like I couldn't turn back and go back inside because he had already seen me. Not sound logic, I know, but I just wanted to drive away. So I continued towards my car. As I was getting in my car, he was there, holding the door, preventing me from shutting it, and he said, "I have never felt for anyone what I feel for you," along with a lot of other weird things I don't remember because I was so creeped out. He then asked me for my number, to which I said no. He asked me why not, and told me he wouldn't let me leave until I gave him an explanation. I continually said that I just didn't want to, but he kept confessing his love for me, hoping that eventually I would cave in and give him my number. I got in my car, eventually managed to close the door and started driving, fearful he would follow me. The next day I was working the afternoon shift. At one point I walked into the studio room and he was in there. I didn't see him come in, so I was really shocked. I turned around to leave when he said, "What, no smile? Wow, okay, you're going to be like this now. You're going to get in a mood about it." I just left. I reported it all to my boss, and he was banned from this location of the gym, even though there were 2 other locations in the city that I worked at, and he works out there too. A year later, I started my membership back up at the gym, and I went to work out there, only to find him there again. I don't know why he was always allowed back, but I have never gone back again. Hey fearsome friends, thanks for listening. Please make sure you subscribe and click that notification button so you can be aware of all my videos when they upload. If you have a story that you'd like to hear me record, then please send it to my subreddit, rmissfearsome83, or alternatively email me at missfearsome83@hotmail.com. If you'd also like to support me further, please go to my Patreon and join for as little as $1 a month, where you'll get early access to all my recordings, and they will also be available as MP3 downloads. I also have some awesome merch on the Spreadshirt website. All links are in the description below. Stay safe, stay happy, and remember, keep being creepy.